Here we go. LDS Stories of Faith and Courage, Chapter 6. Also by James H. Martineau. I thought it was only the first 5, but I guess there's a bit more. Chasing Indians. It was on Sunday in the autumn of 1866, I believe, that the worshiping congregation in Logan was startled during the forenoon services by the sudden entrance and announcement by an excited man that a band of Indians from the north, now known as Idaho, had driven off a band of about 40 horses which had been grazing a little distance from town. Apostle E.T. Benson, who was presiding over the services at once dismissed the meeting and called for volunteers to pursue the marauders and regain the stock they had stolen. About 20 of the Minutemen, of whom the rider was one, instantly rushed to the pastures to get their horses, as in such cases no time must be lost. I will here state that a regiment of mounted men was organized in Cache County under the command of Colonel T.E. Ricks, whose special duties were to be Minutemen ready at a minute's notice for the service and preserving the settlements from bands of predatory or local Indians which the country round about swarmed. Each Minuteman was required to keep horses, arms, ammunition, food, and bedding, usually one old quilt or blanket, constantly on hand, and to be ready for military service at any hour, by day or by night or day. It was almost noon when our party started, none waiting for dinner, and none taking with them any provisions. No time must be lost in such cases, as the party were experienced frontiersmen, and knew that thieves would travel with all possible speed to escape with their booty. They having several hours' start, first we must find their trail. No use to scan an open country to descry Indians. They are too crafty and adopt any means to shield themselves from view. Having found their trail, it was swiftly followed until near Hyde Park, where Indians had driven the animals over hard rocky ground at the foot of the mountains, that they might not leave any visible trail, and for a time hinder pursuit, knowing their pursuers would stop and hunt for it, as was indeed the case, a full half hour being thus lost to us. About 20 miles from Logan, the Shoshones turned eastward into the mountains, not far from Franklin. Pardon my sniffling today. So about 20 miles from Logan, the Shoshones turned eastward into the mountains, not far from Franklin. And here Joseph Hyde and another man were sent to Franklin to obtain a supply of food for the party, which was furnished promptly, and the horses was laden and sent forth with our messengers. The rest of our party swiftly followed through the rugged foothills, and about sunset those in the lead came in sight of the enemy at Cub River, and halted for those in the rear to come up, some of our horses being badly fagged with their 20-mile race. The Indians had seen us and showed willingness to fight, brandishing their guns, making derisive signs, and then taking shelter in the dense willows along the riverbank. By the time our party had all assembled, it was dark, and with a heavy storm late in the sky, and with benumbing sleety rain and piercing wind, the pitchy darkness compelled us to camp where we were, not far from the Indians, who were also obliged to camp, as they could not drive a large band of loose animals in such darkness without losing many. The hostile camps, being not far apart, neither dared to have a camp fire, for its light would enable the foe to kill men as they slept, or try to. And so, the night was passed, a night seemingly without end, as we lay upon the cold and wet ground, with but a single quilt or blanket, through which a piercing wind, and at times a sleety rain, chilled one to the vitals, a saddle as a pillow, our stomachs a craving void. And what were the men and food upon which we relied when starting from home? Delayed by their visit to Franklin, they found and followed our trail until darkness made it impossible to see, and then kept on for a while, finally ascending a hill from which they hoped to see the light of our campfire. And there they stood all night, wet, shivering with cold, holding their horses by their bridles. Not until we had abandoned pursuit and we were on our way home did we see them again. Before it was fairly dawn, we were up and away, but the Indians had already gone, not waiting upon the order of their going. Now and then we found a horse that had given out and been abandoned by the Indians, receiving thus 11, which were sent to Logan with some of ours, also broken down by the pursuit over a very rugged route. Often did we ascend the slopes so steep that we were compelled to grasp a horse's tail and make him pull us up the hill. Thus, in a dense forest, we slowly gained upon the band until so close upon them that they scattered, making further pursuit fruitless. Here we deliberated, and much against our wills, turned homeward, although we had gone 2 days without food, the most appetite-stimulating exercise possible. All were willing to spend another day in like manner if we could recover the rest of the stolen horses. But it was deemed impracticable, and we turned homeward. It was fortunate for us that we did so. The Indians, as we afterwards learned, had determined to fight rather than lose their plunder, and had taken ambush all round our party. As we stood counseling, their guns were leveled upon us to shoot us down had we made another forward movement. There were about 30 in number, and their first unexpected fire would probably have killed or wounded all our party. On our homeward way, we traveled upon unknown trail until after midnight, when suddenly, in the black darkness, we heard the sound of approaching horses. Silently, each man prepped for an instant action, and our challenge sounded, "Who is it?" "Friends," answered Joseph Hyde, in a very welcome English, and we halted right there, and had an enjoyable lunch after more than 2 days' fasting. Hyde and companion had been hunting us all the time, and they had not accidentally met us, and had gone on to meet the Indians we had pursued. Their end would have suddenly come. Our party arrived home without any noteworthy incident, and little was the thought of our experiences. Similar ones were so frequent. At this date, most of those participating have passed to the other side, and their children are enjoying the fruits of their arduous and at sometimes perilous experiences. Whew. Sorry, just a moment. This is what's really interesting about these historical stories. Pardon me. In the end, how frequent was it really? He says that was a very common occurrence. This one's noteworthy because he later found out that if he were to stay, they would have been killed, that kind of thing. I suspect, I don't know how he would have found out the way by which they were planning on killing him, unless later on some of them became friends through means then or otherwise, or perhaps someone else had a different vantage point than him to express what was going to happen. But either way, I think it's fascinating to note that as long as you're trying to do what's right, I think God helps us out on both sides. Because the one side of the tale we don't have is the Indian side. For obvious reasons, it's just because they weren't writing it down, and they had other things to do, I'm sure. So, and as we noticed from the very first story, a lot of these Indians are just living barely from time to time on the substance that they can eke out from the land. And so, a lot of times, these are crimes of just opportunity and passion, saying, well, it's there, and I can take it, so why not? Which is very sad, because, if you could get used to a new or better way of life that is beneficial for your children and your children's children, why keep to the old ways? Right? And that's the hard part, is being able to recognize when it's better to move on to something new. All right. Francis M. Lyman's Mission to the Indians by Edward H. Anderson. The early missionaries to the Indians found themselves in trying situations, and this story tells how the Lord directed their efforts. Edward H. Anderson, the author of this story, was for many years editor of the Improvement Era. The Latter-day Saints have always taken great interest in the promulgation of the gospel to the Indians. Apostle Francis Marion Lyman's mission to the Lamanites in the central part of Utah is one of peculiar interest. He was called by President Taylor on November 17, 1882, at a time when there was a general revival in missionary work among the Indians to labor among the Shoshones of Tooele County, and the Utes of Uinta. At the same time, other brethren were called to preach among the Indians, both to the north and to the south. It was nearly 6 months after his call that the eastern portion of Elder Lyman's mission was filled. He, having in the meantime attended several stake conferences, among them being Weaver's Stake, January 20th, 1883, when President L.W. Shirtliff was installed as president of that stake, Tooele San Pete, Emory, and Millard. He had also filled his Indian mission to the west, where William Lee had been accepted as the president of the Indian mission in Tooele County, with O.H. Barris, John A. Erickson, Benjamin L. Bowen, with families as missionaries. He had, between March 13th and 21st of that year, established with the Indians in Deep Creek on 1,000 acres of land, with water and some improvements, having also with his brethren preached to them the gospel and its restoration through the prophet Joseph, and taught them the doctrines and his history contained in the Book of Mormon. It was, therefore, in the early part of May that year, before his labors began toward filling his mission to the Utes in Uinta, May 5th and 6th, 1883, he attended the Wasatch State Conference in Heber City, where he was made necessary preparations for the journey eastward. From the beginning, it seemed that everything worked against the success of this undertaking. At length, after much delay from the breaking down of their wagons, the party, consisting of President Abraham Hatch, Frank A. Frotton, and George T. Giles, were camped in Strawberry Valley, where they were joined by Bishop John Spencer and Elder Hiram Steele of San Pete. These latter brethren had been compelled to leave their supplies with an Indian named Nephi as a guard on top of the mountain in 4 feet of snow. The San Pete brethren returned to their homes, having come only to help get the supplies over the mountain from Spanish Fork, while the party rested upon the current creek, waiting for the arrival of the supplies, which were taken from the abandoned wagon. The following peculiar incidents occurred. Elder Lyman took his gun on the morning of May 10th and went out 2.5 miles from the current creek to a Sugarloaf Mountain, which towered about 1,000 feet above the tableland and in the vicinity. Arriving at a foot of the mountain, a sudden impulse seized him to climb it. He did so slowly, and upon arriving at the summit, he found a large flat stone, smooth as a table, which he stood upon. Sugarloaf Mountain. Something tells me that means a small kind of hill. Never heard that term before. So he's standing on the flat rock. In passing, it should be stated that when he had been given this mission by President Taylor and had approached him for instructions as to what to do, no definite plan of work had been outlined. He had been told that he was personally entitled to a knowledge of the work and the spirit of his mission. The same was the result when President Woodruff of the Quorum of the 12 had been asked for advice and instruction. Elder Lyman was therefore troubled to know what cause to pursue, whether to go right in among the Indians, or whether to ask permission of the agents to perform the mission assigned to him. In the latter case, running the risk of being refused, and so having a stop put to his work without accomplishing any good, which has been the case with some of the other missionaries in other missions, to whom permission to preach had been denied. While on this stone, with these thoughts in mind, he took off his hat, fell upon his knees, with his face turned to the east, toward the field of his labors, and poured out his soul in prayer to God. I went right before the Lord and told him all about my troubles, he says, how everything was against us, how little I knew about the work, how I had learned that the agents at Uinta and Ouray were bitterly opposed to the Mormons and their doctrines, and then asked for the successful opening of the mission to the Lamanites in that region. and that God might guide me aright and soften the hearts of the agents with favor towards us and our and our cause. Just as he kneeled to pray, the atmosphere having been perfectly quiet up to that moment, a wind began to blow, which continued to grow stronger as he continued his prayer, until, at the close of the half hour in which he was engaged, it blew with the velocity of a tempest, so that he could scarcely remain in his position. When he finished praying, the wind suddenly abated, as it had begun. Interesting. And he retraced his steps to camp. He felt convinced that to go right on with his mission, visit the agents and the Indians and preach to them, was the right thing to do. His ability to receive the impressions of the approbation in his work when he was doing right was strongly developed in Elder Lyman. In many of the important steps of his life, he has been approved through dreams and inspirations, and even visits of men of God who had gone before. It has thus been made perfectly clear to him that his course was approved and his actions upheld. These visits and inspirations had been a source of great comfort to him. So, in this instance, while he saw no vision, he was strongly impressed with the idea. Go ahead, you are on the right track. He felt that his troubles and obstacles would be like the wind, perhaps strong, but soon over with. And so it occurred. But he scarcely looked for such a terrible personal affliction as was soon to come upon him. On the 11th of May, he engaged with men in the lassoing of some wild horses that had been brought into camp. He was an expert at this business, and he could lay a rope around the front feet of the animal to perfection, often taking 10 in a stretch without a miss. On the morning of the 12th of May, a camp was up early, and it appeared that all the difficulties which had so far surrounded them were at length overcome. He was sitting on a camp stool just before breakfast and reached over to pick up some object when he was suddenly seized in his left side with the most excruciating pain that could be imagined. It was a threatened rupture. It was so severe and agonizing that all hopes of his recovery were given up. Everything that could be thought of was done to relieve him, but all to no avail. They had no medicines of any kind, and of the brethren proffered to send 50 miles away for a doctor. But Brother Lyman forbade him, saying that he could not last till the arrival of a physician. It was suggested that he be taken back, but it was impossible to move him. The pain was so tormenting. For 2 hours he remained in such terrible agony that the cold sweat stood out on great beads on his face. During this time he says that every good act of his life passed before him. And strange to say, not an evil thing that he had done came to his mind, nothing but good. He saw himself carried home dead, and he beheld that the consternation of his family at his death, and at what had overtaken him. During all this time, strange to relate, neither he nor his companions, although they had done every other thing to alleviate his sufferings, had once thought of the ordinance of administration. It never once entered my mind, he said, nor did the brethren think of it. At the close of that time, one of the brethren suggested administering to him, which was accordingly done. No sooner were the hands of his brethren lifted from his head than the pain left as suddenly as it had come. He became perfectly free, and had thus been healed by the power of God by the laying on of hands by the elders. Then, he says, I thought of how good it is only to be free from pain. It is the greatest heaven of all, and yet the most of our lives we are free but scarcely appreciate it. He fell into a sweet sleep, and in a comparatively short time was able to proceed on the journey. Up to this time, Satan seemed to determined that the mission could not be opened up, but from this time on the trouble was over, and the way was clear, and everything was favorable, and it seemed that every obstacle was removed without hands. Arriving among the Indians, the missionaries received with marked kindness by both the Lamanites and agents, J.J. Critchlow of Uinta and F.J. Minius of Ouray. Everybody attended the meetings. The Gospel and the Book of Mormon were freely taught by Elder Lyman and his brethren. Chief Tabby also preached together with many others of the chief Utes who were firm Latter-day Saints. They bore powerful and fearless testimonies. Missionaries were selected, sustained, and set apart. Had a conference in Ashley on the 19th and 20th of May, and were called to continue the labors which they did with much spirit. They were Jeremiah Hatch, Israel Clark, Jeremiah Hatch Jr., Thomas Caron, George Glynis, and Thomas Bingham Jr. The Indians were largely converted and baptized, and both chiefs and laymen rejoiced in the word of God. Temporal good was also accomplished. The missionaries found an old chief who was more interested in temporal than spiritual affairs. He had arranged a canal straight up the banks of the river to his land, and was waiting for the water to mount into it to irrigate his possessions. The missionaries remonstrated with him, saying that the water would not run uphill. He insisted, however, in a surly manner, that the Mormons made it run uphill. It was explained to him that it was only appearances that seemed to him so, and the water ran only downhill. They taught him how it could be done, however, whereupon he wished them to do the work. They asked permission from the agent to build a canal to water their possessions of the old chief, which was gladly granted. The 6 missionaries set to work upon their task. They obtained plows, scrapers, horses, and in the course of 10 days had a canal ready, which proved a great success in watering the lands of the elated chief. For this useful labor, the missionaries were afterwards allowed $1,000, which they divided among them, thus receiving both temporal and spiritual blessings. This is why I'm really enjoying this book. You get the sense of what all these different stories that you don't get told. You don't get told the ones where the natives are, stealing things and, pardon me, and acting in ways that are contrary to what we're used to, because we don't want them to look bad, and because of political correctness. At the same time, we don't get the good stories either. The ones where we can see that, look, both the pioneers and the native tribes all were trying to work together at many points as well. So it just, the problem is that the loose association of each tribe and also their needs at the time can be extremely varied. So instead of having one standard approach and one standard result that you can get from dealing with someone because of the stability of their situation, you're not going to find it. Plus there was, as you could see, Ute, Shoshone, Paiute, that were all in these stories. And each of those tribes will have different kind of cultures in how they approach things. And so if you can see, there's a lot of times where they were actually working together and making lives better. And that was the point of a lot of the preaching, is not only to help them accept the gospel, but help make their lives better. In addition to that, this reminds me of the quote from Brigham Young that he would rather give them the bags of flour than give them something to fight against, right? It's easier to feed, basically, I'm terrible at the paraphrasing, but the idea is that he'd rather feed the Indians than fight the Indians. And it's true. Help them come to your way of life, and there will be a lot less contention and a lot more in the way of helping each other and surviving better. All right. The Big Wolf of Dark Canyon by Albert R. Lyman. And you know what's interesting about that last one is how detailed he was in the names of who was called and where. I have a sneaky suspicion that, you know what, I'm going to have to call it here because as you can tell, I have a little bit of a cold. I have a sneaky suspicion that he was keeping a very good journal, because there's a point at which you take very specific detailed notes of who was where and at what time, and that way you can present it appropriately when the chance comes. And I think, I wonder how well we do that now. I doubt we do very well at all. I think we're very prosperous, but I think that also means that we lose a lot of that resolution because we don't feel like the history rests upon our shoulder to keep track of who is doing what. As a pioneer, where you're out away from civilization and you're trying to build something up, and any man that is lost is a devastation to your efforts. Knowing who's doing what where is all very important to keep track of. I would hope that we remember to write our stories down, especially the ones that are faithful, because it's a show of remembrance towards the blessings that God gives us. If you notice, each of these have a touch of the divine, whether that's by instruction and healing, whether that's by help at the most dire of situations, or protection from the worst of circumstances. And just as the former author had said, I'm always most grateful for my health when I'm sick. And the reason why is because, just as he says, I know that even when I'm mildly sick in some way or having trouble, that the blessing of feeling well again is on its way, and more importantly, that my minor inconvenience makes me stronger. And so with that, I hope that you also are enjoying these stories, and the Spirit of God will be with you. We'll see you.